The sky above Sci-Fi 7 was dark with storm clouds, and the wind carried the scent of burning metal. Daniel's boots crunched against the cracked ground as he stepped out of the wreckage of his drop pod. Smoke rose from the twisted metal behind him, but there was no time to check for supplies. He had a mission, and time was running out. Lying a few feet away, half covered in dust, was the reason he was here. Queen Velka. She was an alien, tall, thin, and insect-like, with smooth kitten covering her body. Her limbs were delicate, her silver eyes half-closed in exhaustion. She was wounded, her breathing slow and uneven. Daniel had seen aliens before, but never one like her. She looked fragile, like she could break with a single touch. But she was important. The auxiliary people were on the verge of defeat in their war against the Dominion Syndicate, a ruthless empire that ruled through fear. If Velka died, her people would fall. If she survived, there was still hope. Daniel didn't care about politics, but he cared about his job. He had been paid to get her across the wasteland to an extraction point, and that's exactly what he was going to do. Daniel knelt beside her. "Can you walk?" Velka blinked at him, her voice weak. "Not fast enough." That was a problem. The wasteland stretched for hundreds of miles, filled with dangers, hostile creatures, extreme weather, and worst of all, Dominion hunters. They would be searching for her, and they would show no mercy. If she couldn't move fast, she wouldn't make it. Daniel sighed. "Guess I'm carrying you then." He reached under her arms and lifted her carefully. She was lighter than he expected, her body almost weightless in his arms. He adjusted his grip and started walking. The extraction point was 5 days away. He just had to survive until then. The wasteland was as cruel as the stories said. The sun was a pale red ball in the sky, giving little warmth. The ground was dry and cracked, with jagged rocks and the occasional dead tree. In the distance, sandstorms raged, shifting the landscape like an ocean of dust. Daniel moved quickly, his military training keeping him alert. He listened to every sound, watched every shadow. Velka remained silent in his arms, her breathing steady but weak. After an hour, he spotted movement. A Dominion patrol. 3 soldiers in dark armor, scanning the area with glowing visors. They were moving in his direction. Daniel ducked behind a large rock, keeping Velka close. He could hear their voices through the wind. No sign of the Queen yet. She couldn't have gotten far. The crash site is close. Orders are clear. Find her. Kill anyone helping her. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had no weapon, no armor, nothing but his instincts. He waited as the patrol passed, their footsteps crunching against the dry earth. When they were far enough, he moved again, sticking to the shadows. He needed to find shelter before nightfall. The wasteland was dangerous during the day, but at night it was worse. By sunset, Daniel found a small cave hidden between 2 cliffs. It wasn't much, but it would keep them safe for the night. He set Velka down against the wall and checked her wounds. "Still breathing?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "You should have left me." Daniel scoffed. "Not my style." She looked at him with tired eyes. "Why?" He didn't answer. He wasn't sure himself. Maybe because he had seen too many people left behind in the past. Maybe because he wasn't the kind of man who abandoned someone who needed help. Or maybe because, for all her alien appearance, she was just another person trying to survive. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and wrapped it around the worst of her wounds. "Get some rest. We move at dawn." Outside, the wind howled, and the night creatures of the wasteland stirred. The hunt had begun. The wasteland was never silent. Even in the dead of night, the wind howled through the cracked ground like a whispering ghost. Daniel sat near the entrance of the cave, his back against the cold rock, listening. He had trained himself to sleep lightly, but tonight, sleep refused to come. Velka lay inside, her breathing slow but steady. She had not spoken much since they entered the cave, only asking for a little water. Daniel had given her his last sip, knowing they would need to find more soon. Water, food, and shelter, 3 things they could not go without. But the biggest danger was not thirst or hunger. It was the Dominion patrols. They were out there, searching for her, searching for him now too. His mind replayed the words he had heard from the soldiers earlier. Orders are clear. Find her. Kill anyone helping her. Daniel exhaled through his nose and gripped a small rock in his hand. It wasn't much of a weapon, but in the right hands, anything could be dangerous. Then he heard it. A low hum, distant but growing closer. He turned his head slightly, focusing on the sound. It wasn't the wind. It was mechanical. A drone. Daniel stood slowly, stepping further into the cave. "Velka," he whispered. Her silver eyes opened weakly. "What is it?" "We have to move." She tried to sit up but winced. Her wounds were slowing her down. She would not be able to run. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had carried her across the wasteland all day, and his muscles were aching, but there was no choice. He knelt beside her. "Hold on to me." She hesitated, but he gave her a look that told her there was no time for questions. With some effort, she wrapped her arms around his shoulders. He lifted her once more, steadying his balance before stepping out of the cave. The night air was colder than before, sending a chill through his sweat-soaked shirt. He scanned the sky. Then he saw it, a small black drone, hovering in the distance, its red sensor light scanning the ground. Daniel cursed under his breath. If the Dominion had sent drones, it meant soldiers weren't far behind. They had to go. Now, Daniel moved fast, keeping low. His boots barely made a sound against the dirt as he weaved through the rocky terrain. Velka's weight slowed him, but he adjusted his grip and pushed forward. Behind them, the drone shifted directions. It had seen them. A bright red light flashed, followed by a loud mechanical beep. Within seconds, the sky was alive with movement. A distant ship roared, changing course. Daniel didn't look back. He knew what was coming. More drones, and worse, hunters. The first gunshot rang out. A plasma bolt struck the ground a few feet away, sending dust into the air. Daniel ducked behind a boulder, pressing Velka close. "They're coming," she whispered. "I know," he said, adjusting his grip on her. His breath was heavy, but his mind was sharp. He had survived worse. He had fought in places more dangerous than this. Another shot whizzed past. They were testing his position. The Dominion never rushed in blindly. They were patient hunters. Daniel took a deep breath, then moved. He zigzagged through the terrain, making himself a harder target. Plasma bolts followed, hitting the rocks around him. He could hear the soldiers now. 3, maybe 4. Then he saw it, a steep drop ahead, a canyon. It was risky, but he had no choice. Daniel sprinted toward it, pushing his legs beyond their limit. The ground trembled as more shots rained down behind him. Then he jumped. For a moment, there was nothing but open air. Then he hit the ground, rolling to absorb the impact. Velka let out a pained gasp, but he held onto her tight. The slope beneath them gave way, sending them sliding down the canyon wall. Dust and loose rocks followed, creating a small avalanche. They tumbled down, finally landing in a pile of soft sand at the bottom. Daniel groaned, shaking his head clear. His arms were still wrapped protectively around Velka. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded weakly. "You jumped off a cliff." He smirked. "Yeah, I do that sometimes." Above them, the Dominion soldiers had reached the edge. Their visors glowed in the darkness, scanning the canyon. Daniel held his breath. They couldn't shoot blindly, or they risked losing their target. One of the soldiers spoke. They fell into the ruins. Ruins? Daniel turned his head and realized they were surrounded by large ancient structures, crumbling pillars, half-buried statues. This place had once been something important. Now it was just another part of the wasteland. The soldiers above hesitated. We should wait for reinforcements. No, another said. We go down now. The queen won't escape again. Daniel's heart pounded. They had only bought themselves a few minutes. He looked at Velka. Can you move? She winced but nodded. I can try. He helped her up, keeping one arm around her for support. His body ached, his energy was fading, but he refused to stop. Then let's go, he said. And together, they disappeared into the ruins. The ruins stretched before them like the bones of a forgotten world. Towering stone pillars, cracked and broken, stood like silent guardians of a history long buried beneath the desert. The walls of old structures were covered in faded carvings, symbols of an ancient civilization lost to time. Daniel didn't care about history. He cared about survival. He led Velka deeper into the ruins, keeping close to the walls. His breathing was heavy, his muscles burning from exhaustion, but he didn't slow down. The Dominion soldiers were coming. Velka stumbled beside him. He caught her before she could fall. I can still walk, she said weakly. Barely, he muttered. She gave him a tired look, but there was no time for argument. They needed to find a place to hide before the soldiers reached them. They moved through the ruins in silence. Daniel kept his ears sharp, listening for movement. Velka, despite her injuries, was alert too. She seemed to know the danger as well as he did. After several minutes, they found a half-collapsed building. The roof was mostly gone, but the walls still provided cover. Daniel guided Velka inside and helped her sit against a stone pillar. You rest, he said. I'll keep watch. Velka shook her head. You need rest too. I'll rest when we're safe. She didn't argue this time. She closed her silver eyes, her breathing slow but steady. Daniel crouched near the entrance, scanning the ruins. The night was quiet now, but he knew it wouldn't last. The Dominion were hunters. They didn't give up easily. His mind wandered for a moment. He had taken on dangerous jobs before, but this was different. He wasn't just delivering cargo or gathering intel. He was carrying a living, breathing person, someone the Dominion wanted dead. And for some reason, he refused to let them win. An hour passed, maybe two. Velka stirred. You're still awake. Daniel didn't look away from the ruins. Yeah, you should sleep. He smirked. You're really concerned about my health, huh? She didn't smile. I don't understand humans, she said quietly. You had no reason to take this mission. No reason to help me. Daniel shrugged. I was paid. Velka's eyes studied him. No, it's more than that. He exhaled. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was more than just money. I don't like seeing innocent people get hunted, he admitted. And I sure don't like the Dominion. Velka's gaze softened. Humans are different. We feared you once. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Feared us? She nodded. The first time my people learned about humans, we thought you were dangerous. You were unpredictable. You fought wars not for resources, but for ideas. You never surrendered, even when you should have. The Dominion feared you too. Daniel chuckled. Yeah, well, we're stubborn. Velka looked away. Now I understand why. There was something in her voice, something he couldn't quite place. Respect. Gratitude. He sighed. Get some more rest. We move at sunrise. Velka hesitated but finally closed her eyes again. Daniel leaned against the wall, gripping his small rock. He had no gun, no armor, no real plan. But he had one thing the Dominion didn't. A reason to keep going. And that was enough. The first sign of trouble came at dawn. Daniel was already awake when he heard it. Distant footsteps, slow and careful. The Dominion had arrived. He glanced at Velka. She was still asleep, her breathing steady. He hated to wake her, but there was no choice. He touched her shoulder lightly. Time to go. Her eyes snapped open. She didn't ask questions, she knew. Daniel helped her to her feet, and together they slipped out of the ruined building. The ruins were filled with shadows, long and deep in the early morning light. Daniel moved carefully, keeping close to the walls. Velka followed, her steps light despite her injuries. They reached a narrow alley between two broken pillars. Daniel peered out. 3 Dominion soldiers. He recognized their armor, dark and polished, their visors glowing red. They were scanning the area, moving in slow, steady patterns. These were professionals. They wouldn't make mistakes. Daniel's mind worked fast. Fighting was not an option. Running would be too loud. They needed a distraction. He looked around. Then he saw it, a loose stone, large enough to make noise but small enough to throw. He picked it up and tossed it across the ruins. It hit a pile of rubble with a sharp clack. The Dominion soldiers turned instantly, weapons raised. Daniel grabbed Velka's wrist. Go. They moved quickly, slipping through the ruins while the soldiers investigated the noise. Seconds later, a voice rang out. They're here. Daniel cursed. So much for sneaking. The chase was on. Daniel sprinted through the ruins, Velka right behind him. Plasma bolts whizzed past, striking the stone walls, sending dust and debris into the air. The Dominion were fast, but Daniel was faster. He led Velka down a crumbling staircase into a lower level of the ruins. The air was cooler here, the walls covered in old carvings. He didn't stop to admire them. This way, he said, pulling Velka toward a tunnel. She stumbled but kept moving. A plasma bolt hit the ground near them. The explosion sent them both flying. Daniel hit the ground hard, his vision spinning. His ears rang from the blast. Velka groaned beside him. She was alive. Footsteps echoed through the ruins. The Dominion were closing in. Daniel forced himself up. His body ached, but he ignored the pain. He grabbed Velka and pulled her to her feet. There's no way out, she said weakly. Daniel's eyes darted around. The tunnel ahead was blocked by rubble. The way they came was filled with soldiers. Then he saw it, a crack in the wall, just big enough to squeeze through. He grabbed Velka's hand. Trust me. Without waiting for a response, he pulled her toward the crack and shoved her through. Then he followed, just as the Dominion reached them. They were safe. For now. Daniel squeezed through the narrow crack in the wall, his body scraping against rough stone. His breath was heavy, heart pounding. The moment he was through, he turned and reached for Velka, pulling her the rest of the way. Behind them, Dominion soldiers shouted orders. The glow of their visors flickered through the cracks, searching. They won't take long to find another way in, Velka whispered. Daniel nodded. He scanned their surroundings. They were in a long, narrow chamber, the air thick with dust. The walls were covered in ancient carvings, but Daniel had no time to study them. We need to move, he said. Velka limped beside him, her silver eyes filled with exhaustion. Daniel knew she was pushing herself past her limits, but stopping wasn't an option. A distant explosion rumbled through the ruins. The soldiers were breaking through. Faster, Daniel urged. Velka gritted her teeth and forced herself to move quicker. They reached the end of the chamber, where a collapsed section of the wall left a small opening to the outside. Daniel peered through. The wasteland stretched beyond, bathed in the golden light of sunrise. We're almost out, he said. Velka nodded weakly. Daniel crawled through the gap first, scanning for any signs of movement. The area seemed clear, for now. He helped Velka through, then turned to get his bearings. In the distance, a jagged mountain range loomed over the horizon. That was their destination. The extraction point is 3 days away, Daniel muttered. We need food, water, and we need to lose the Dominion. Velka gave him a tired look. Do you always talk to yourself? Only when things are bad, he said with a smirk. Then, footsteps. Daniel tensed, spinning toward the sound. 5 Dominion soldiers were moving toward them, weapons raised. Daniel grabbed Velka's hand. Run. They sprinted across the rocky terrain. Plasma bolts whizzed past them, burning holes in the ground. Daniel pulled Velka behind a large rock, pressing her against it for cover. He peeked out. The soldiers were advancing, moving in formation. Think. He spotted a dry ravine nearby, steep but climbable. It led toward a cluster of old ruins that could provide cover. He turned to Velka. "Can you climb?" She hesitated. I think so." "Then let's go." They ran for the ravine. The soldiers saw them and fired. Rocks exploded around them, sending dust into the air. Daniel reached the edge and jumped down, landing hard. He turned just in time to catch Velka as she slipped. Above them, the soldiers reached the edge. One aimed his rifle. Daniel threw a rock. It struck the soldier's visor, making him stumble. Go, Daniel shouted. They scrambled through the ravine, their hands gripping the rough stone as they climbed. The soldiers followed, their boots clanking against the rocks. One soldier jumped down, landing a few feet away. He raised his rifle. Daniel lunged. He grabbed the soldier's arm, twisting it hard. The gun fired into the air. Daniel used the momentum to shove the soldier back, sending him tumbling down the ravine. The others hesitated. That was all Daniel needed. He and Velka climbed faster, reaching the top just as more shots rang out. They ran into the ruins. Inside, the ruins were dark and quiet. Daniel pressed against the wall, catching his breath. Velka leaned beside him, struggling to stand. He studied her. "You're getting worse." She exhaled. "I just need rest." Daniel frowned. She was pale, her breathing shallow. If they didn't find medical supplies soon, she wouldn't last another day. He looked around. The ruins were old, filled with broken statues and strange markings. Then he noticed something. A doorway half hidden by fallen stone. "Stay here," he told Velka. She nodded weakly. Daniel moved toward the doorway. Inside, he found a small chamber. The air was stale, but the room was untouched. A stone table stood in the center, covered in dust. And on it, a medkit. Daniel's eyes widened. Lucky day. He grabbed the kit and rushed back to Velka. Velka winced as Daniel wrapped a bandage around her wound. The medkit was old, but the supplies were usable. "You're better at this than I expected," she muttered. "I've had practice," he said, tightening the bandage. She studied him. "You were a soldier." Daniel nodded. "A long time ago." "What happened?" He hesitated. "I stopped believing in the fight." Velka didn't press further. Instead, she closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel exhaled. "Get some sleep. We move at sundown." Outside, the wasteland stretched into the unknown. The Dominion were still hunting them. But for now, they had survived. The ruins were quiet. Too quiet. Daniel sat near the entrance of the crumbling structure, his eyes scanning the wasteland beyond. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky with streaks of red and orange. Shadows stretched long across the cracked ground, swallowing the remains of the ancient city. Velka was resting inside, her breathing more stable than before. The medkit had helped, but she was still weak. Daniel rolled his shoulders, trying to shake off the exhaustion creeping into his bones. He hadn't slept properly in days. Every muscle in his body ached from carrying Velka, from running, from fighting. But he couldn't stop now. The Dominion was still hunting them, and they were getting closer. Velka stirred. She slowly sat up, wincing as she shifted her injured leg. Daniel turned to her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She took a slow breath. "Better than before." "That's not saying much." She smirked slightly, but the exhaustion in her eyes was clear. Daniel looked back toward the wasteland. "We need to move soon." Velka frowned. "We've been running all this time. We can't keep going without a plan." Daniel nodded. She was right. Running wouldn't be enough anymore. "We have to lose them for good," he said. Velka's silver eyes studied him. How? Daniel exhaled. We don't run. Velka tilted her head. Then what do we do? Daniel's grip tightened around the small rock in his hand. We fight. The plan was simple. They had been running from the Dominion all this time, barely staying ahead of them. But now, they would turn the tables. Daniel knew how Dominion soldiers operated. They were precise, calculating. They didn't charge blindly into fights. They used strategy. But so could he. He had been a soldier once, and even though he had left that life behind, the skills never faded. Velka watched as he moved through the ruins, gathering small supplies, loose stones, broken metal, anything he could use. You're setting traps, she realized. Daniel nodded. If we can take out even one or two of them, it'll buy us time. Velka hesitated. Are you sure about this? No, Daniel admitted, but we don't have a choice. Night fell. The air grew colder, the wind whispering through the ruins. Daniel crouched in the shadows, his breathing slow and steady. Velka stayed hidden behind a broken pillar, her silver eyes watching. Then, the sound of footsteps. The Dominion had arrived. Daniel counted at least 4 soldiers. Their visors glowed red in the darkness, scanning the ruins. They moved carefully, rifles raised, their boots making almost no sound against the stone. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were hunters. Daniel gritted his teeth. Good. That means they won't expect this. The first trap was simple, a pile of loose rocks stacked in a weak spot. As the first soldier stepped past, Daniel threw a small stone, hitting the pile. The rocks collapsed, crashing down on the soldier's legs. He fell with a muffled cry, pinned under the rubble. The others reacted instantly, turning toward the sound. That was their mistake. Daniel leaped from the shadows, slamming his fist into the second soldier's visor. The impact sent the soldier stumbling back. Before he could recover, Daniel grabbed his rifle and yanked it away, tossing it aside. The third soldier fired, missing by inches. Daniel ducked, then tackled him to the ground. They struggled, rolling across the dirt. The soldier was strong, but Daniel had the advantage of desperation. He grabbed a piece of broken metal and struck the soldier's helmet, cracking it. The soldier groaned, dazed. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the soldier's wrist and twisted, forcing the rifle away. Then, a sharp click behind him. Daniel froze. The fourth soldier stood a few feet away, his rifle aimed directly at Daniel's head. Velka moved before she could think. She picked up a stone and hurled it at the soldier's head. It wasn't much, but it was enough of a distraction. Daniel took his chance. He lunged forward, knocking the rifle aside. The shot fired wildly into the air. Daniel grabbed the soldier's arm and twisted, throwing him to the ground. Before the soldier could react, Daniel delivered a swift blow to the back of his head. Silence. The fight was over. Daniel stood, breathing hard. His hands were scraped, his muscles aching. But they had done it. Velka approached slowly. Are they? Daniel shook his head. Unconscious. But they won't stay that way for long. Velka looked at the fallen soldiers, her expression unreadable. You could have killed them. Daniel exhaled. I don't kill unless I have to. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then we should go, she said. Daniel agreed. The Dominion would send more soon. They had bought themselves time, but not much. He looked toward the mountains in the distance. We need to reach the extraction point, he said, before more of them come. Velka took a deep breath. Then let's not waste time. Daniel nodded. He adjusted his grip on his injured arm, then turned toward the wasteland. The hunt wasn't over yet. But for the first time, the hunters had become the prey. The wasteland stretched endlessly before them, a sea of sand and jagged rocks under the pale moonlight. Cold wind howled through the ruins behind them, carrying the scent of dust and distant fire. Daniel's legs burned with exhaustion, his breathing heavy, but he didn't stop. Velka walked beside him, her steps slow but determined. She had regained some of her strength, but not enough. Every few steps, she stumbled, and Daniel had to steady her. "We need to rest," she muttered. "We rest when we're safe," Daniel replied. She sighed but didn't argue. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and sharp against the night sky. Their goal was near, but the Dominion wasn't far behind. Daniel knew they had little time left. As they climbed over a ridge, Daniel spotted something in the distance, a small structure half buried in the sand. It looked abandoned. "Shelter," he said. Velka followed his gaze. "Could be a trap." Daniel nodded. "Could be, but it's our best shot." Cautiously, they approached the building. It was an old supply station, long forgotten. The doors were broken, sand covering the floor inside. Daniel checked the corners, his grip tightening on the small rock he still carried. No movement. No sounds. "Clear," he said. Velka slumped against the wall, exhausted. "Just a few minutes," she muttered. Daniel hesitated, then sat across from her. His body ached. His mind screamed for rest. But rest was dangerous. He forced himself to stay awake, listening for any sound outside. The night was still, almost too still. Velka studied him. "You never stop watching, do you?" Daniel smirked. "Old habits." She tilted her head. "You were a soldier once. You left. Why?" Daniel exhaled. "Because I got tired of fighting wars that weren't mine." Velka was silent for a moment. Then she said, "And yet here you are." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, here I am." She smiled slightly but didn't press further. For a while, they sat in silence. The only sound was the wind outside. Then, footsteps. Daniel tensed. Velka sat up, alert. Someone was out there. Daniel moved quietly to the doorway, peering into the night. Shadows shifted in the distance. Figures moved between the rocks. The Dominion had found them. "Time to go," Daniel whispered. Velka nodded. She stood, wincing as she put weight on her injured leg. Daniel led her to the back of the building, where part of the wall had collapsed. They slipped through the opening, stepping onto the rocky ground outside. The Dominion soldiers moved carefully, sweeping the area with glowing visors. Daniel's mind worked fast. The mountains were close, but the open ground between them was dangerous. "We need a distraction," he muttered. Velka reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device. "This might help." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" She pressed a button. The device beeped softly, then flickered with light. "A distress beacon," she said, "modified to send false signals." Daniel grinned. "Smart." She tossed the beacon toward the ruins. It landed with a soft clink, then activated. Instantly, the soldiers turned toward the sound. Daniel grabbed Velka's wrist. "Run." They sprinted toward the mountains. Behind them, the Dominion soldiers moved toward the beacon, weapons raised. The distraction wouldn't last long. Daniel pushed forward, his legs screaming in protest. Velka struggled to keep up, but she didn't stop. The ground became steeper, the rocks sharper. They climbed higher, slipping between narrow paths and jagged edges. Then, a gunshot. Daniel barely had time to react before a bullet struck the rock beside him, sending shards flying. The Dominion had realized the trick. "Move," he shouted. Velka gasped but pushed forward. More shots rang out. The soldiers were close. Too close. Daniel spotted a narrow crevice ahead, a gap between two cliffs. "This way," he called. They squeezed through, the passage barely wide enough for them to fit. The soldiers fired, but the bullets ricocheted harmlessly off the stone. For a moment, they were safe. They emerged on the other side, breathless. The mountains stretched before them, their peaks reaching toward the sky. The extraction point was near. Daniel checked their surroundings. No sign of the soldiers. "We lost them," he said. Velka collapsed onto a rock, breathing heavily. Not for long. Daniel nodded, but long enough. He looked at the sky. Dawn was approaching. They had one last push before they reached safety. Velka met his gaze. One more day. Daniel smirked. One more day. The fight wasn't over yet, but the end was in sight. The first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Cold air clung to the rocky slopes as Daniel and Velka climbed higher, their bodies exhausted but unwilling to stop. The extraction point was close, just beyond the ridge ahead, but the Dominion wasn't far behind. Daniel turned, scanning the path below. He couldn't see the soldiers yet, but he knew they were coming. Their hunt had lasted too long for them to give up now. Velka's breathing was heavy. Her injured leg trembled with every step. Almost there, Daniel assured her. She nodded, pushing forward despite the pain. But Daniel wasn't sure if almost would be enough. Reaching the top of the ridge, Daniel pulled Velka up beside him. Before them lay a deep valley, its floor covered in mist. A large rock formation jutted out in the distance, the extraction point. Daniel felt a spark of hope. "We made it," Velka whispered. Then, a gunshot. Daniel shoved Velka down just as a bullet whizzed past. He spun around. The Dominion had caught up. 5 soldiers, moving fast, their weapons raised. Daniel clenched his jaw. No more running. "Go," he told Velka. "Get to the extraction point." She hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll hold them off." Her silver eyes locked onto his. "You won't survive." Daniel smirked. "Not the first time I've heard that." Velka's hands clenched, but she nodded. "Don't die." She turned and ran. Daniel took a deep breath. Then he grabbed a rock and faced the soldiers. The first shot hit the ground near his foot. Daniel ducked behind a boulder, gripping the rock in his hand. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all he had. The soldiers spread out, moving in. They were careful now. They had learned that Daniel wasn't an easy target. Good, he thought. Let them hesitate. He peeked out, spotting one soldier breaking away from the others. A mistake. Daniel moved fast. He rushed forward, slamming the rock into the soldier's helmet. The impact sent the man staggering. Daniel grabbed his rifle, yanking it away. The soldier fell, dazed. Now Daniel had a weapon. The other soldiers reacted instantly, firing at him. Daniel dived behind another rock as plasma bolts scorched the ground. He checked the rifle. Half a clip left. Not much, but enough. Taking a deep breath, he aimed and fired. One soldier went down. Another barely dodged. Daniel moved, zigzagging between the rocks. The soldiers fired wildly, trying to pin him down. Then, Velka's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Daniel, the ship is here." Relief flooded through him, but he wasn't done yet. The soldiers advanced, closing in. Daniel fired again, forcing them back. But then, click. His rifle was empty. Daniel cursed. He tossed the weapon aside and grabbed another rock. The soldiers realized he was out of ammo. They moved in. Daniel took a deep breath. He had one last chance. He picked up a small piece of metal from the ground and threw it at the nearest soldier's visor. The soldier flinched. That was all Daniel needed. He lunged forward, tackling the man. He grabbed the soldier's sidearm and fired, point blank. The remaining 2 soldiers hesitated. Daniel stood, gun in hand, breathing hard. Then, a deafening roar filled the sky. The Dominion soldiers looked up. A massive transport ship descended from the clouds, its engines kicking up dust. Velka stood on a ledge, waving. "Daniel." Now, Daniel didn't waste time. He turned and ran. The last 2 soldiers fired at him, but the wind from the ship's engines threw off their aim. Daniel sprinted across the rocky ground, his legs burning. The ship lowered a platform. Velka reached out. Daniel jumped, grabbing her hand. She pulled him up. As the ship ascended, Daniel looked down. The remaining Dominion soldiers watched, their faces hidden behind their visors. They had lost. Daniel exhaled, slumping against the wall of the ship. His whole body ached. Velka sat beside him, equally exhausted. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Velka chuckled softly. "We actually made it." Daniel grinned. "Yeah, against all odds." She looked at him, her silver eyes full of something unspoken. "You saved me." Daniel shrugged. Seemed like a good idea at the time. She smirked. Then she closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to rest. Daniel leaned back. For the first time in 5 days, he wasn't running.